I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna, a citizen of the native village of Klutika along the Copper River in Alaska and of Sicilian descent. And I'll begin by respectfully acknowledging that I'm here at the University of Arizona, which is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. And today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Offamaniyaki. And I guess for brevity, I'll say I'm an assistant professor in the College of Public Health, associate director of the Native Nations Institute, but really my heart work is I co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and I'm chair of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And I spend every day working in relation with my friends and colleagues at the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Andrew, the go-to guy.
The go-to guy, sorry, thank you. Skugtash, everyone. My name is Andrew Martinez. I'm Thanatham, Degeno, and Yaqui. All my peoples are from the Southwest region of the United States. I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in Oregon. And excited to be here. Thank you to the panel for asking me to serve on this and asking questions. Sorry for blowing up the chat. Actually, not sorry for blowing up the chat with all those links. It was requested. So I'm excited. Listening to Dominique talk, I always love listening to her talk. Just getting fired up over here. Just wanting to see yes, yes, yes to everything that she was saying. So I think it's going to be a good conversation here. So excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Andrew. And James, I'm not sure if James sleeps with all of the work that he does, all the email that he sends out. And I said, how does he do all of this work?
Mahalo, Bill, is that right? Aloha, Bill.
Yes. Perfect.
I'll call you uncle because I think you're a little bit older than me. So I'll call you uncle today.
I'm probably a lot older than you.
Well, it's good to be with you. Wow, what a chance! What a chance and honor to be with the Rising Voices conference again. Unfortunately, I have never been to a Rising Voices conference, so maybe the next best thing for me is to be here with you virtually. I do have a number of roles. I love my work. I'm at a point in my life now where I get to be involved in a lot of different things, and so today's panel, I moderated the Phosphor-G international meeting here this morning. And we were talking about data sovereignty, and I was asked to speak a little bit about that from an Indigenous perspective, and just working with other Indigenous people around the world this morning, and talking with also the collaborators was really good. So I'm ready to go. You don't need to hear everything I do. It's just that with time being what it is, I'm ready to go. So again, Hamidake Pichante Washtena Pechizapolo. James Rattling, back to you, Bill.
Mahalo, James, and mahalo to the panel. I'm hoping that we can have more of a conversation among the three of you on this. We have some guiding questions to begin this, but I think listening to the three of you speak with one another, and through that speaking to us is something that could be really beneficial. There are so many questions that I had, and thoughts of follow-up with what Dominique had just spoken to us about. Just let me begin with this one prompt, and Stephanie, because you are the one that is prominent and really a huge mentor to so many on this issue. I'd like to begin with you and begin this conversation. So in these collaborations between the indigenous knowledges and Western sciences, we come to partner with each other. Is how important has data sovereignty, what kind of contributions has data sovereignty provided to a deeper relationship among the partners and a deeper understanding of the issues? In Hawaiian, we call it ike, and I think Doc Tusi mentioned that yesterday, is having that not just that deeper understanding and deeper knowledge, but the deeper connection with each other and with those issues.
Yes, I think this is a really important question, and I know Dominique gave us some thoughts about it, and I really want to jump off of some of those, which is you know, what we're doing in Indigenous data sovereignty work is really centering Indigenous self-determination and moving towards values-based relationships. And some of the really important context for this is that these relationships start before the projects start, which is a research practice that we all like to promote. But they also have to do with deeper issues like identity and purpose, as well as futures. So how do we begin to, thinking back to Dominique's beautifully drawn slide there of her children and the lessons they're learning and how we begin to change those lessons, how do the relationships that we have begin to create a space for not only that relationship to bloom, but for us to grow and advance our own aspirations for our children and our future generations. And what does that look like in practice? And so I say that because, you know, we think of relationships as just among us as people with our environment, for brevity there, but also what do those look like in our application to data? And so we can talk more about that, but it's things like, how do we build data systems that reflect our values? How do we create policies and practices like Dominique was talking about that provide the guardrails for those relationships to bloom and for those futures to grow? And I'll stop there and allow, I know others will have things to add, but I think the conversation is off to a good start. So thank you, Bill.
Oh, Stephanie. James, do you have any reactions, thoughts, additions to this?
Well, I think, I'm just going to agree with Dominique and Stephanie. Certainly learning from their work. And I know that, just as an example, I mentioned this morning, we were participating in the hackathon. And again, that brings together Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders within that community, technology people from different organizations. And there was a lot of emphasis on the global South, those Indigenous people in South America. And, if you know that history, you know that it's pretty difficult down there for them, to say the least. And so we just had a great conversation again about the importance of things that we just heard. Those data Indigenous governance models and structures, and the discussion of United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, FPIC. I'm really encouraged, at least as I learn and be involved more on these global issues, about some of the progress that's being made. And we also had a question from a researcher, an Indigenous person from Mexico. He was asking me, again, how do we work with collective rights versus individual rights of Indigenous knowledge? I think there obviously is still work to be done. And how I responded to him was basically, it was a hard question for me. I just talked a lot about from the Lakota perspective. So I try to speak from the Lakota perspective as much as I can, and what I understand how we deal with our knowledge and how we share that and what that means. But I do think it really comes back to, for us, it's the idea of Wolakota. It's a big term, and it talks about respect. Respect for one another, respect for our knowledge, and respect for our place in the world, and also how we deal with and accept knowledge, and how we work with that knowledge in meaningful ways. And so I think that to this panel and to what we're talking about today, I do know that there's many things happening in the world, and I think that these kind of conversations are important. And I think that Rising Voices did a great job in putting together this data sovereignty panel and the topic itself and where it goes from here. I think we all got to be involved. We all got to figure out how to build a platform to collaborate and to corroborate. And I think those things are before us. And I just remember again, remind us that we got COP26 coming up here in a few weeks. Again, you know, you hear the tension between those major entities are making decisions for the future, and what role do Indigenous people have and our data. I mean, they want our data, they want our knowledge, but they don't want us to help make decisions. And so I think that you know, it's all hands. You know, we have to figure out how to do this, and I'm appreciative of the time here today.
Mahalo, James. Andrew, you know, you are part of the wave that Dominic had mentioned, those leaders that are growing and coming up next. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, good question. So listening to Dominique talk and the responses and thinking about these questions, some of the stuff that comes to mind is actually one of the topics that came up is like fiscal years in our planning meeting. And you were telling me a story, and my response back was like, relationships and justice and climate justice don't work in fiscal years. And so we need to be like aware of that, and building relationships with the communities happens in the background, offside, before the proposals are written, before anything, before that funding is made available. And then I also want to add that I just listened to a presentation from Chairman Jamie Azure from Turtle Mountain, and he said, if you're looking to work with tribes in any capacity, is like meet them where they're at. Indian country is a spectrum of levels of infrastructure. And so part of data sovereignty and supporting data sovereignty and data stewards is building tribal data capacity. And so you may be wanting to work with a community or include a community, but you have to meet them where they're at. Some may be at a higher level, more than one person in a department, may just be a committee that's serving and wanting to move forward on something. So just be aware of that. And yeah, learning about the history of research in Indian country and also within these communities specifically. So I'll stop there for now.
Oh, Andrew. You know, part of the theme of Rising Voices this year is elevating our discussions. And in this instance, you know, it's elevating data sovereignty. And can you speak to how this elevation of data sovereignty contributes to centering justice in these collaborations between Indigenous knowledge holders and you know, Western Earth scientists? Let me start with Andrew first, then. Just have you sort of continue that conversation.
I was just waiting. I didn't want to speak out of turn. Centering justice. First off, who's defining justice? Is it the researchers? Is it the funding institutions? Is it the communities? Those sort of conversations have to happen again on the back end. Define justice and start there. That's a big part of it. Moving forward is within building data stewards and the work that Dominique and Steph are doing. If I'm the next wave, I got to make sure that the next wave following me is coming in, right? I got to make sure that that's moving in, building up, and is gonna, you know, keep that flow going. So yeah, I'll stop there again, and then I'll pass the mic over to Steph or Ray or James.
Go ahead, Steph.
In Hawaii, being able to ride that wave, you know, we say you need the right surfboard.
Thank you. So I think, you know, there's a few answers here. I really appreciative of Andrew bringing the tribal perspective to the table and making sure that we're building tribal infrastructures and capacity and paving kind of opening up the path really for those to come behind us. And I think that's something, you know, within the academy, as a scientist or quasi-scientist as I might be, one of the things that I'm always fighting is that I'm there for others. And the rest of my colleagues generally are not. You know, they're there for their own purposes, and their commitments are different. And so I come in every day for my students and my colleagues, and I come in every day for Indigenous data sovereignty. And what that looks like is not only having their back and promoting them in terms of, if I get asked to do a talk, asking them to do a talk, and mentoring them to how do you have those relationships around it. But it's also thinking through how do we grow and center justice? For instance, I'll use the Academy as another example, through our advocacy within that space. And so one example now is by 2023, anyone who has NIH funding has to revamp their whole data management process, right? Because there's a new data management plan. So what's our opportunities there within academic institutions to revolutionize how we interact with Indigenous data within our repositories as researchers? And so, you know, a lot of people fall quickly into the ethics and education route, which is really, really important that we're present there. But there's other things, like these institutions will be creating template data management plans or revamping their template data management plans. How do we put language about Indigenous data sovereignty, about tribal self-determination into those plans so that they have to delete it, right, in order to create their own template, and which means they're going to have to think about it at some level. And so it's small movements like that. And it's also partnering with other entities who are really trying to, for instance, we're in the process of creating indicators for the CARE principles so that we can assess how people are actually implementing them, whether it's performative or whether they're truly doing the work. And partnering with research projects who are evaluating themselves and applying it. Partnering with other folks like the Earth Science Information Partners who are going through a process of doing care, trust, and fair. So issuing guidance on how to practice those for repositories, and being present for that and inviting all of these up and coming scholars into those spaces, because their input, for instance, Andrew's input into ESIP's conversation is pivotal, you know, and his experience as in a community, in community with others, and also within the growth of Indigenous data sovereignty. You know, he's been there from the start with some of this language and verbiage and beautiful slides, you know, since we started working there. And so there's, you know, we really need to just figure out where we can tweak things. And I'm a proponent of small changes across the board. So you heard Dominique talking about that too, about how do we make changes at funders, how do we make changes at publishers, how do we make changes in the universities that all create the scaffolding that support tribal self-determination.
Right. I'll go and say, I think just continuing with that thought, you know, I think we need to look at philanthropy, the role of philanthropy and how they fund, especially with climate, right? So I work in climate a lot, and I know that it's been told to me many times that philanthropy is going to have a more and more role in climate adaptation. So I think that we need to figure out how we connect, and the word was decolonizing a lot. I also like to use the word indigenization a lot in terms of how we move these different ways of knowing forward. Also, I think that I'm working with tribal historic preservation officers when it comes to centering justice. You work with those folks, you know that they have a big job. They have a big task, THPOs, and they're very underfunded and they're very under resourced. And so we're trying to understand how we best support them. And because I think they've been innovative in a way of using technology to look at places and sites and how they deal with that. And then how do you deal with that data? I think there is going to be a greater emergence of virtual realities and those kind of things. And so that's data collection, and which requires data management. Also, I think my working with the University of Colorado Boulder, again, you know, we look at the young people. I know I'm glad that there's university folks here. You know, we have a Tribal Climate Leaders program, and, you know, that program is now going into more of the data sovereignty data side, because those students now are beginning to work with tribal communities, and they have a lot of interesting work that they're doing around you know, plants and cultural resources too. So I think that, this is going to be an approach that I think that requires, broad understanding. It's going to require both leadership from the tribal side, academia side, and even those organizations that are tribal in nature, but they're not tribal government. I think we have an emergence of tribal nonprofits now that are doing a lot of work that tribes could do. So is that helpful or not helpful? And how do we know that? So I think those are some of the thoughts that I have going forward.
Mahalo, James. I'd like to do a little bit deeper dive too in, when we think about data sovereignty, and this is, I know, something that Dominique is dealing with as well, but the metadata and working these collaborations and coming up with the fields that actually address, that eventually get to not just centering justice, but the self-determination. What have been your experiences in developing these metadata fields that aren't typically part of our scientific research yet needs to be there? And the follow-up to that is in dealing with the funders, and especially when you talk about the federal government where things need to be public, and and not all those fields are releasable to the public based on the responsibilities that we have as Indigenous knowledge holders. How do you address these? How do you develop the correct metadata fields and get that into the conversation? Stephanie, like this, I know you thought long and hard about this and working on it. So.
I have to admit, my thoughts are still in that messy creative phase. So even though I've been in that space, so I think there was a comment in the chat or in one of the questions that in general our data fields are poor, and I mean that's just where it's at, it's we're in this place of so I am the chair of a working group at the IEEE, which is electronics and electrical engineering, but they set standards for a lot of data in a lot of fields, and we're working to create a provenance of Indigenous people's data recommendation. And we're not actually working to create a very defined set of provenance. We're working to create space, right? So what we're lacking in a lot of these places, and what, for instance, those metadata tags that Dominique showed you from local context do, is kind of wedge in and start to creating space within existing systems for recording things like provenance, permissions, protocols, and what the balance here is that you want to create space for those within our the metadata fields and within our data within our databases, but you don't want to be prescriptive, because you need to allow space for individual communities to be able to apply that information, right, in the way that they in their own language, in the way that they conceptualize it, and so forth. And so there's a very fine balance there. And I think, what I've experienced over the past, especially over the past year, and talking more and more about how do we, for instance, impact repositories, is that there's a great deal of interest and growing interest in applying Indigenous data sovereignty to repositories. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, of actually breaking into and putting space into those repositories, it gets tough, right? Because you're taking space. And we all know from our office space to our sitting at a table as a decision maker, that when you begin to take space, that sometimes you get pushback, right? And so just being able to be there and have a whole community behind you, your community, but this community behind you, to acknowledge that that space is fundamental to two things. It is fundamental to allowing Indigenous nations to be in relationship with their data, right, to continue to steward their data if it is in these repositories or in these other places, but also to making sure that Indigenous communities can access their data, because without that information around provenance, around geographic information, there's no way of finding all of this Indigenous data that are out there. And there's so much Indigenous data out there that we need to have access to for our own purposes, not in terms of contributing to others, but contributing to our own desires and priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, you have any follow-up on that?
Just building on the for us, by us, or by them, for us, and taking or having access provided to that data and information that has been collected, legacy data that, there was no consent at the time taken or given, but then extracted, as some folks have put in the chat previously. I don't necessarily work around the metadata stuff as much as Steph does, but it's always interesting to hear what she says. And I think my thinking around this sort of space actually goes back to something you said to me in 2019 was, we're setting a table that we're never going to eat at. It's not for us to sit down at. We just need to make sure that we're preparing it. And so this sort of work, having these conversations, asking these questions, creating that space is what we need to be doing right now, but still asking future questions as they come up and develop.
James.
I need to work with Stephanie more so I can get a cool Stephanie quote. I need one, Steph, so you have to give me one. I guess what I see here, listening to both of you, the question is really about data repatriation. Just like we've worked as tribes to repatriate items of cultural patrimony across the time, from museums and from the other places, and how long it's taken to do that kind of work, and who was involved in that work, and how were decisions made to bring back. Not only, I think that's a good model to look at. Also think is that, obviously the capacity development needs to happen at the tribal level or in partnership where the tribes can host and manage these data that they do repatriate. I think that we're going to need people again. I think we're going to need this workforce to be able to do the data repatriation and to do that kind of work. And I think that through prayer and ceremony, I think these things will have to happen. And I think that, just as we are decolonizing here in America, with the MMIW work and just recently the work that we've done on Rosebud to bring back our relatives from Carlisle. I mean, those kind of events to me are important milestones that we really have to pay attention to and think about how that work was done. I mean, there was a number of people involved in that work, different kinds of technology, the kind of expertise was involved in that, and as well as cultural leaders. So I think those are things that I would think about when I think about data repatriation in terms of your question, Bill.
Thanks, James. I want to follow up on that a little bit. And, mine is with respect to at least a couple things that we mentioned earlier, as well as what you'd mentioned. One is, with the funding that comes from the federal government, there's always this caveat that the information is public. But as you repatriate data, again, not all of that is public. So how do you, in these collaborations, you want to have this mutual respect and deeper understanding, but how do you get through those conversations to a place where you can actually agree on responsibilities that you have to maybe protecting some of this, but also understanding what can be done for the greater good that can be released. The greater good meaning the greater good to our Indigenous people.
Moving the conversations to the data governance mechanisms, data sharing agreements, NDAs, building all that in the back end also is part of that. Understanding what the concerns are beforehand from the communities and what they're willing to share, what they're not willing to share, whether they're willing to have that out in the public initially and bring that back in to a place where it's not. But that's within maybe a non-federal funding sort of situation, or it can be worked into a non-federal funding situation. But obviously our eyes are on that as well and changing those sort of institutional policies there as well. So.
James, you're on mute.
I'll jump in and say, I think we need to look at maybe things like the 638 contracting process if we're talking about the federal government. I wonder how tribes today view the progress and success of 638 contracting. You know, what if we could contract that aspect of data and data repatriation and even development of new areas, and that we have the capacity to do that. I mean, those are federal laws, those are federal policies, and it seems to me tribes have seen that, or even the self-governing tribes. You know, my work really centers around self-determination and tribal sovereignty. As I do all these different things, I always go back to, again, our leadership at the local level, whether they're imperfect, perfect, or all that. I mean, but that's what we have. And I think that things like that, I would say that might be mechanisms, might be ways that we can, as Steph talked about, incremental change. You know, it'll take a long time, but I think we need to really do an assessment of current mechanisms like 638 contracting, where we can advocate and certainly work with the data that we're talking about.
Thank you. Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on
that? Yeah, I'll get a little bit concrete and story here. So, you know, I think about how do we begin to shift, for instance, like federal policy and Dominique's work around looking at federal environmental policy. And, you know, the NIH has a lot of policies, and they have, you know, travel consultation policy. They have policies written into, for instance, you know, data and data management. And I think, you know, I have a lot of problems with how they work at NIH, but I do want to highlight, you know, although their data management plan is what I would call lacking for Indigenous content in it, they do recognize in some of the documentation around it a really important point that Dominique put out. So in previous data requirements at NIH in different areas, they would mention, you know, if a tribe had a law, like a written law that said you couldn't share data, that they would honor that, and it didn't have to be put into deposited into the repository. This new language notes that these laws and customs may exist without writing, so that they are in the community, right? They don't use that term, but that's basically what they're saying, is that they're there. And what I see behind that is a responsibility, right? So if we're working in those communities, we have to be able to uplift those and make sure, and that's a responsibility on a researcher and also on the federal funders to be able to push that. And so another highlight is one of the findings from Dominique's project is that NSF doesn't have any written policies around research and engagement with tribes or Indigenous communities. And while that might be shocking or not to some of you, it is an important piece because there is opportunity there to learn from how other entities are doing it and not doing it, right? And where do we begin to put into place these responsibilities that uphold what we're talking about here today? And I think some of that is, you know, federal entities too can only do so much. And here we get back to the scaffolding piece, right? So while there's these high level proclamations from federal funders, what does that mean in practice as you go down through the layers? So through the layers of universities, through communities, through researchers, and where can you begin to put into place different tactics and techniques there to make sure that you're supporting those notions of collective benefit and authority to control, right, and the care principles.
Thank you. Apologies. I think there's some background noise on my end. You know, we have, all of us are at home working, and we all have Zoom conferences going on. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. But you know, I'd like to go back a little bit to one of the topics that Dominique brought up. Oh, and also remind everybody to you know, submit your questions, you know, via Slido if you have them. But we always mention stories and storytelling, but also the data that resides within them. And you know, what have been your experiences in understanding them and collecting them, getting access to them, and incorporating that into the data aspects of research projects? James, can I start with you?
Well, thank you, Bill. Well, I think you know, what I'll share with you is you know, so one of my roles again at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center is to work on tribal engagement in the 7 states here, and in that work, we've been able to support tribal nations as they deal with a changing climate, in particular climate adaptation planning. And so one of our strategies in that team, so I have a team of consultants and tribal leaders and cultural bearers on that team, and I'm part of that team. And I know that at this point right now, we're working on how do we approach our tribal elders to share information about climate. And so what we've done is we worked with our treaty council. So we have a treaty council, for those who are familiar with that, here in Rosebud. And we also have our tribal leaders here as well, part of that tribal treaty council. And those are our knowledge holders. Those are the ones who are most responsible for keeping and sharing that information. And to this point, you know, we've made progress very incrementally, just because I think it's just you know, we're dealing with COVID. And so again, if you know the story, we still struggle up here in the Northern Great Plains with COVID. But I would say that that we have a tribal historian. His name is Victor DeVille, and I think one of the interesting things I can share a little bit about it is that we have something called Lakota Star Knowledge, and so we've been trying to link this climate adaptation work with Lakota Star Knowledge, which is a big ask. It's a big challenge just because the complexity of Lakota Star Knowledge, but it deals with language. I think it deals with observation, both of the skies as well as the earth. And also it's challenged because, you know, our language proficiency on the reservation now is diminishing. And so, you know, we're challenged by how we communicate this information with one another. And so we need interpreters. We need brokers to help us translate those things for us. And I think that for our work here on Rosebud, you know, it's been real slow, but I think that, you know, we do got to go back and revitalize those systems like Lakota Star Knowledge, and we go deeper into that. And how do we teach that today to the next generation? How do we teach that to me and others like me who, you know, who missed a lot growing up, who missed a lot, you know, by doing what I do, but also knowing that that with that knowledge, with that wisdom, you know, I can certainly use that and work with that and to begin to address those big issues that we face as Indigenous people with a changing climate. So, so I think that's one of the things that I would say and share with you all.
Thank you, James. So, you know, how can those of us, you know, and focusing on you, work with climate models as opposed to more concrete observational data, help to further Indigenous data sovereignty in your experiences? You know, James, you work a lot with climate. Stephanie, certainly you do. Andrew, you're the wave.
This is where I listen. I need to be able to not only speak, but listen and take everything in. So I would almost post this back to Bill, even as a moderator of this panel, is like this knowledge generation continues even through these panels.
Any other thoughts or reactions?
I think we need more Indigenous people doing modeling. I think some of the bias that's inherent in this process is that the models are biased, right? And the way that they're conceptualized and the foundations don't always reflect the realities, right, that we live. And we need, more Native data scientists, more Native mathematicians, and all of this. And that's kind of the root. I think in the practice of it is really just questioning constantly what are the biases and assumptions, and how do we begin to change that, not only by the inputs, right, and the data that we're using in these models, but in how we're creating and using them and applying them.
Bill, I would respond by this. We just at the University of Colorado Boulder, we just submitted a large proposal to NSF, and it's called Environmental Science Data Innovation and Inclusive Lab. That was the title. And there's a vision there to really diversify data science and to begin to work with those underrepresented communities. Let's face it, to be direct, I mean, it's white men that are doing the data science. And so, so there's efforts to change that, to transform that, and provide more opportunities. So, so in our proposal, we're really looking at the role of tribal college and universities. I came from the tribal college system, and I'm so grateful for the tribal college system and where it met me when I was seeking a career or a pathway in life. And so I think that there's potential there in terms of a pool of young people. I think that we have to think about, again, going even younger. I know that there's interest in looking at, in schools in South Dakota, for instance, I became aware that where I went to school, it was, we had there was 30 people in my class when I graduated from high school. And so I go back there today and it's changed. There are a lot more Native students in that class, where when I was going to school, it was predominantly non-Native. And so today, the majority is Native. So our communities in South Dakota, close to reservations, they're up. We're changing. More of our young people, the demographics are shifting. And so I have a nephew in school, and he's a freshman in high school. And so we were just talking one day, and he said, "Uncle," he said, you know what I'm doing in school?" I go, "What?" He said, I'm learning how to code." I go, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, we got this class. I think we're doing it online, but we're learning the code." I said, "What was your motivation to even want to pursue coding?" Well, he said, "Uncle," he said, I love gaming. I love gaming, and I just sort of love creative things, and being in a rural area, there's still not much to do when I grew up, but there's this effort, or there's pockets of activity in the Indian country, and we can't note every single moment of what's going on, but for me, it was just a light bulb for me that these small rural schools in South Dakota, and their internet's getting better. The schools are trying to open these doors for these new pathways for Native students to pursue, and one of them is data science or computer science as well. So I share that with the audience today, that I think we all have a responsibility to connect with our schools. Those students are there. I think they're waiting, and we have the wherewithal to create opportunity. Then we need to do it. I think we can't blame anybody else, but we have to, what we know, we should do it. And I think that's our responsibility.
Thank you, James. Within this realm of climate modeling, I don't know if Dr. Rosie Aligado from the University of Hawaii is on right now, because she's been off and on. She has a lot of students that she's dealing with, of course. But she is involved in a really interesting project. And I think this has relevance to our discussion on data sovereignty. And, this is on the ENSO, so, El Nino Southern Oscillation in the Pacific Ocean, and how these models are, regional in scope, but they don't do a whole lot with respect to providing an understanding of what's going to happen in your specific locales to a smaller scale. But what we have, what we have in Hawaii is we have a huge repository of things that have been written in the Hawaiian language. Newspapers, journals, articles, in addition to the stories, chants, songs, and dances, where a lot of that information resides. So the newspapers described a lot of the daily occurrences of things. So it described things like climate, what's happening with the fish, societal issues, those types of things. But going through and translating a lot of those, because at one time Hawaii is about 90% literate, because of when the missionaries came in, the Hawaiians figured, that written word is something that's really important for us to stay with or stay ahead of what's coming coming down in the future. Translating all of that has been a labor of love over the last several years, and there's some really interesting things that are coming out of that. But also looking for the data that resides within those stories, chants, songs, dances, those epic tomes, like Dominic had mentioned earlier, the Kumulipo, the creation chant, and translating that into data that spans generations. We always talk about the generational expanse of data that we have that resides within us, that legacy that our ancestors have passed on to us, and incorporating that into this climate model, at least for the Pacific. And Rosie would be,
save the world.
Rosie is unmuted. Okay, Rosie, is Rosie there?
I'm here. Good morning. Aloha, everybody.
Aloha, Rosie. Could you elaborate just a little bit on what I'm trying to say about the question on climate modeling and indigenous data sovereignty and the stuff that you're doing with Lenny?
Oh, I think mahalo for bringing emphasis to this project. Our reasoning behind starting this project was the realization that we wanted to know what our words were for climate phenomena, because in part of the resurgence and revitalization of the Hawaiian language, there was a lack or perceived lack of curriculum for particularly in the geosciences, and a lack of linguistic, like just a lexicon. And so people were kind of translating English words into Hawaiian, and like the Hawaiian word for carbon was going to be carbono. And so I was really inspired to try and understand what were our words, or what are our words, and to restore them to our modern usage. And so to that end, what we did was to go back to the Hawaiian language newspapers. And it was really interesting because our conceptions, of course, of these concepts are much more metaphoric, much more holistic. And I think with the question with indigenous data sovereignty that we always come across is, what is the appropriateness of translating these words into English for English usage, number one, when so much of this is actually interpretation rather than translation, meaning that there's so much that we are also not capturing. And 97% of our Hawaiian language newspapers are not translated. And so there's just so much rich knowledge that is still held by our kupuna that we need to get access to. And there's a lot of questions around, who should be translating that and what it should be used for. So mahalo.
Mahalo, Rosie. It's a great project, a fascinating one. And in a climate context, this is one of the things that, at least coming out of the University of Hawaii, that is really fascinating and interesting. And if you have any questions, I'll volunteer Rosie. She's amazing too. We have about 6 minutes left and several more questions. So here's a real interesting one. Indigenous colleagues come into Western dominant space and being disrespected or even making non-Indigenous PIs feel threatened or display dominance over Indigenous colleagues. Can you give advice or encouragement to Indigenous colleagues who feel unmotivated to continue to work in that space?
That's another place. I am sure you can find free ways to trim that paragraph.
I'll say something because I deal with this every day. Every day it makes me want to cry, but it also makes me want to laugh and do more. And so I think so some of the words I hear are things like radical, disruptive, offensive, threatening, exclusive. Those are all words that have been applied to me, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on a weekly basis, but regularly. And for me, the way I stay around is by creating community and connections with my research team and with the students that I work with, and finding really good mentors. And so having people who are sitting there beside me and validating what I see and what I'm doing, instead of being, immediately offended by my presence. And so I think what that looks like in practice is, on Zoom, creating spaces. Now we're on Zoom primarily, creating spaces where we are able to support each other within our institutions. So like in our research groups, but and participating, like I know Rosie because Rosie and I participate in a broader Indigenous scientists, scholars group internationally, where we support each other. We can tell our hard stories, and we can also write grants together and promote our work. And I think that's one of the things that I see often within academia is you see not Indigenous scholars promoting non-Indigenous scholars, right? And so they're inviting them to write papers with them. They're writing them into their grants. They're doing all the things that are the currency of academia together, and they're bringing each other along. And so that's what we need to be doing. And, I have to admit, I wasn't mentored like that until like 5 years ago, and until I got into the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. And that's when I met scholars who have been doing that for me. So people like Tahu Kukutai and Maggie Walters and others who have made sure that I can be participating in some of the really progressive work that's going on and being present in it. Like this space that I have was made possible by them. And so my whole goal is to make that space for others and to move them into it. And so, there's Andrew the Wave over here and other people who are coming up behind and then can be part of that.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, this is James. I would say one of the aspects of our Tribal Climate Leaders Program is the connection to culture. We're in Boulder, Colorado, and as we put together that program, we really thought about these students that were being recruited to come as a cohort, and they came from different tribes. And if you know the Denver metro area, that's real diverse. Many tribes are now, and that sort of seems to be a trend. So we worked very hard to identify not only sort of the academic mentors and coaches for these students, these graduate students, but also how can they stay close to their culture? How can they use that culture to build and strengthen their resilience when they face these oppositions, as you said, and to help them deal with the complexity of those things. So I think that's one. I think our cultures, again, as they are, provide a means and a way to strengthen ourselves. And I would always encourage Indigenous people that I come in contact with if to reconnect and to strengthen their connection to their culture and to the ways and use those things to help them, because we all need it. I don't know who you are. We still need that spirituality to strengthen us, and that's what our ancestors did. And no matter where they went, no matter what they confronted, they had that power and that strength to keep on going. And I would also just, these are leadership opportunities as well. The world is what it is. We have to function in a world that's different than ourselves as well. And so I think leadership matters. I like to say leaders lead. That's what they do. And that's why I'm appreciative of all you here on the call today as leaders within yourselves. You found a way to get there and continue to grow and develop. So, and then people are watching you. I always say that, wherever you're at a meeting at Rising Voices or at University of Arizona, you have young people and other people that are watching you and how you deal with the difficulties of life and difficulties of academia. So don't forget that, that in some ways you continue to make that path more available for young people and let that be a motivation. I think we all need to reinvigorate our motivation. And also we need to rest. Bill says I don't really work that hard, Bill, but I rest a lot. And I think that we got to take care of ourselves, right? That's self-care. So don't forget to take care of yourself. And that's why I think our culture there's beauty and there's power and there's strength in our culture. And so let's continue to practice those ways.
Mahalo, James.